But in 2015, the movement got to its height of total unregulated movement. And this was the year in which it had started off in the beginning of this decade we're in, partly people fleeing the Syrian civil war, but then people from all across sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, the Far East. And I started traveling to the camps in southern Europe where people were arriving in. I've been to many of the countries they were fleeing from. And it was a veritable United Nations of people. Now, in the eyes of some of the governments and many of the public, it was all people fleeing the Syrian civil war, but it wasn't. It wasn't. Even by the EU's own figures, at least 60% of the arrivals in 2015 had no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the rest of the world.
So when Angela Merkel invited 1 million refugees was the term. Migrants, let's call them migrants.
Yeah.
When she invited 1 million of them into Germany, this is crude. I'll put it badly. You sharpen up what I'm about to say, because this is the way an American would look at it. The Germans are still acting in some way or another out of a sense of war guilt.
Sure.
That's straightforward.
Oh, absolutely straightforward. I mean, I have no doubt about it. I mean, this is a job for a psychiatrist in many ways. Look at the reception at Munich station. As 10,000 people were arriving every 48 hours or so at the height of the movement in 2015. They were coming up through the Balkans and up through Central Europe. And there were crowds at Munich train station, high-fiving the arrivals, giving them balloons, teddy bears. What was it? It's perfectly obvious. It was Germans elated at the sight of people breaking into their country rather than trying to break out.
Right. So, but even at that, even if it was a kind of act of German self-indulgence, an acting out of war guilt, the whole argument was that these people were unfortunate, that they were fleeing civil war, and you're saying that 60% of them simply weren't.
A lot more than 60%. I mean, what you get into in all of the issues with migration is, and specifically European migration, is people find it incredibly hard to know where you salami slice issues. So, for instance, they say, yes, we'll have people coming in who are genuinely fleeing the Syrian civil war, for instance.
Right.
Well, there's an argument about that as well. You can look after 100 Syrians in a neighboring country for every one you look after in Europe. So it's not efficient in all sorts of ways, whether or not it's humane. But let's say that, yes, okay, people fleeing the Syrian civil war. But then you have the people, including the aid agencies, making the point, well, and one Afghan refugee made this to me to my face. He said, Syrians have only been at war for 5 years. We've been at war for 15 years. Why should they have priority? Very good question. So you go along that, and then you get to the thing that all of the aid agencies and the NGOs and others have been doing for years, which is you elide and rub out the difference between people fleeing war and people fleeing economic deprivation.
Right.
Now, one of the reasons why I'm quite tough about this is because I know where that argument leads. Gallup last year did a poll in sub-Saharan Africa. 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africans want to move. They're not going to go to Saudi Arabia. They're not planning to break into Yemen. They want to come to Europe. Now, in my view, the catastrophe underlying all of this is the presumption that every country in the world is basically a country for the people of that country, apart from Europe, and Europe is a place for the world.
All right. A few figures from the book. Even as I was reading the argument, these figures, it takes a while to adjust. Again, it's because an American, our notion of what's taking place in Europe lags, I think. But I found every one of these things shocking. By 2015, I'm taking these from your book. By 2015, more British Muslims were fighting for ISIS than for the British Armed Forces. Yeah. By 2016, the most popular boy's name in England and Wales, Mohammed. Mm-hmm. By the middle of this century, this is a projection, by the middle of this century, a majority of Austrians under the age of 15 will be Muslim. And it is single-digit numbers of years ago that every one of those was unthinkable. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I smile because, I find it...
You're used to it.
I find it... if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. I've done the crying. I mean, the point about this is that, again, all of these things you're meant to not notice. You're meant to not say it either. You're meant to say, yeah, okay, so Mohammed happens to be the most popular boy. Then what are you saying, bigot?
Right.
What's wrong with that? Or they find ways around it. They say, no, it's just that we counted the Harrys in a different way that year, and so on. All of these things, there has been an enormous cost that people have been made to pay if they observe what's in front of their eyes. And so we get used to this sort of just period of lying.
Right.
And that's what we've been in.
What is the Orwell? It takes a great effort to see what is under one's nose.
Right.
All right, second concatenation. Again, I'm quoting you, Douglas. At the same time that we've had this influx, at the same time, Europe has lost faith in its beliefs, traditions, and legitimacy. Europe is now deeply weighed down with guilt for the past. And there is also the problem of an existential tiredness.
Yes.
And a feeling that perhaps for Europe, the story has run out and a new story must be allowed to begin. Okay, take us through that a little. Now, the German war guilt, that's clear. Britain seems to me to be, so again, I'm speaking as an American. What was the Churchill movie that was just a big hit last year? We think of Britain.
Darkest Hour, yeah.
Britain has no apologies to make, no reason to feel guilty. Neil Ferguson, other people who've looked at the British colonies, on balance, it's a transfer of human capital.
Right.
They're not impoverishing the people of India. On the contrary.
Right.
And so why would you include Britain? Britain's the hard case to understand why Britain should feel guilty.
Yes.
Or an existential fatigue.
There's several things. One is the phenomenon that if you or I were to sum up all people across, say, Asia as having responsibility for the same thing, people would say,
Madness.
that's mad. I mean, you're not even picking out the important distinctions. You're being very generalizing.
Right.
But you can do that with Europe. So you can say, we did the Holocaust in Europe. You can even get away with that in London. Sorry, we. And then you take the other one, post-colonialism, which you refer to. Post-colonialism and post-colonial guilt is suffered in almost equal measure by, for instance, Britain, which undoubtedly ran quite a lot of the world in the past, and Sweden, which did not. So there's a strange thing that has emerged, which I try to explain in the book, where we end up summing up ourselves by our collectively worst moments. The flip side of that is we look at everyone else only by their best. So recent years, for instance, we've heard an awful lot, certainly since 9/11, about the Islamic Neoplatonists. No one talked very much about the Islamic Neoplatonists until this last 20 years. But the Islamic world is best represented by the Islamic Neoplatonists, whereas Europe is best represented by Auschwitz. Well, here you get to one of the problems of this, is that
That's just uninformed.
Yeah, of course it's uninformed. All of it's uninformed, and it's also imbibed by vast swathes of the public and told to them by a huge amount of academics, media, politicians, and others. There's several reasons for that, isn't there? One is that you can do that almost cost-free as a modern politician, can't you? It's like the endless apologies for historical acts. It can gain you something, but it costs you nothing. All you're doing is selling out and misrepresenting the past. But you yourself might be able to polish a bit of your halo or burnish your reputation in some way. But this is just one element of this. This thing I describe as the sense of the story running out. A couple of people have said, and I'm very glad they've pointed this out, that in some ways it's the most original part of the argument of my book. The immigration bit is important and people should know about it. But this second bit, the us bit, what is it about us that would mean this all happened? Mm-hmm. Not many people have, I think, written about. And by the way, I'm very disturbed about this because almost none of my critics, and there are some sadly, but almost none of them pick up on this thing. Almost none of them. They go for me over the immigration,
right.
But they never pick up on this. I have not to date had one critic who said, you're wrong on the existential tiredness. You're wrong on that. Our best days are all ahead of us, or any of that. I don't get any of that. And that's a disappointment because I was rather hoping I would.